Hey, I just finished reading this book, Titanic Thompson, which is about a guy from the early 1900s who was actually called Alvin Thomas. Now, Alvin Thomas was a guy who couldn't read or write. Um, I guess many people back then couldn't. And his father left pretty much as soon as he was born. And then he used to make his money basically by gambling, tricks, by being a hustler, which, back in the 19th century, I guess now being a hustler is considered, it's cool, I've got a side hustle, this or that. This guy was probably the greatest golf player of his generation, the greatest poker player of his generation, the greatest, actually an incredible athlete as well. He got his nickname Titanic when one day he walked into a bar somewhere and I think he hustled everybody out pool and he just beat them. And then this was when he was about 16, and then he bet people that he could clear a pool table with a single leap. Nobody believed him, so he went out, found a mattress from somewhere, dragged it back into the bar, bet everybody that he'd do it, and literally somersaulted over the pool table and landed on the mattress. And at that point, somebody said that kid sinks more people than the Titanic, as in more people than that lose bets to him. So he became known as Titanic Thompson. It's actually an incredible read. It's the second time I've read it. I bought this book back in 2012, I think. Read it and I thought, well, that's amazing. Um, it's actually a really nice life story as well. This guy who, I'll read the back to you. Titanic Thompson is the rollicking true story of one of the most charismatic characters in 20th century America. Traveling only with golf clubs, a .45 revolver, and a suitcase full of cash, the legendary Titanic was married 5 times to 5 different women, all teenagers, on their wedding day. He killed 5 men, though he'd say they'd all agree they had it coming to them. He won and lost millions in the same time when being a millionaire still really meant something. So his second wife, his first wife divorced him, she married him, and she wanted him to stay at home, but he was always out on the road, he was always out making money. So he basically bought her house, gave her a load of cash, and said, "I'm done," or something along those lines. Um, and then he was walking through Philadelphia, maybe, and someone tried to pick his pocket, and he caught her hand, and they ended up being married. Apparently, his last wife said um, that second wife was the only one, was the one he really, really loved. Um, and he had some of the same flaws as his father. The children he had, as soon as they were born, he left a bunch of money, and he abandoned the wife. Um, Both his sons ended up living with him. They found him. One of them became the greatest card player in Vegas, fashioned after his father. But the story is incredible. I mean, this is a guy who, you know, the other characters you've got in here, Al Capone, the guy crossed Al Capone. um, you know, other famous Houdini's in here. There's a guy called Nick the Greek who was a gambler who died broke, but probably went through about 500 million in his life. Back when most people were making about $500 a year, this guy was walking around with $10,000 in his pocket. It's really an incredible story. It's one of those ones you pick it up, you read it, and then you realize, hang on, I'm done. I've finished it. What do they say? Unputdownable. Um, a guy who really lived off his wits. He had an incredible mind for numbers, so he knew all the odds in poker. He knew everything. And he only took bets that he couldn't lose. But things like throwing a peanut over a building. And how did he do that? It's all in here. It's actually a really excellent book. It's it's quite sad as well. I mean, the guy dies in an old person's home, basically broke. And the lesson in there is most gamblers die broke. Even the ones who make ridiculous amounts of money. He used to go around beating everybody at golf when the golf tournaments paid so little, and he could go out and hustle up 100 grand, 200 grand over a week of playing golf. And so he'd take young golfers with him, um, and they'd go out as teams, or and then there's the scenes where people get shot. There's a scene where someone holds a gun to his wife and he just walks up to them and looks them in the eye. The guy was a legend, a real legend, but it tells a story as well as a story about his life, a story about how times change. So you know nowadays he could never get away with it because he'd hustle one person or he'd clean out one card game and social media. His face would be everywhere. He'd never be allowed to play again. Um, it talks about him driving across state, and then when he drives back 30 years later, there's a road there that wasn't there before, and just it's a story about change as well, which is kind of interesting because right now with coronavirus, the government can't keep furlough schemes going forever, and Brexit in the background. Brexit's going to do more economical damage than coronavirus. Coronavirus is just doing it quickly and fast. I guess it's the difference between being beaten to a pulp. You take notice of that. That's what coronavirus is doing, and slowly dying of obesity, which creeps up on you slowly. But it's going to kill more people. That's Brexit. So this is when the states, he went through the Depression, First World War. Um, it's an incredible story. I think it's well worth reading. Photographs in here of him. There was a guy called the Brain who apparently fixed a Red Sox game, a baseball game, and he gets referred to in The Godfather Part 2, where who played him? Marlon Brando's character says, "I love baseball ever since someone, the Brain, fixed the Red Sox World Series," or something like that. Guys and Dolls, a musical which I've never seen. The main character, Sky Masterton, is based on him, and he's called Sky because one of the guys who was around when Titanic was around used to say, he piles the stakes as high as the sky or something like that. Really, really, really legendary character. A blazing wild whirlwind, according to the Times. There's a couple of scenes in it which are kind of bittersweet. There's other scenes. It's inspiring. It's entertaining. It's breathtaking in parts. You think, wow, did he pull that off? But really, really a good read. Here we go. Here's something from the Independent on Sunday. Ever heard of Titanic, Thompson? Me neither, until I read this enthralling and compulsively readable account of his life. And then from the Metro, a more colourful, exciting biography might emerge this year, but I won't put my money on it. Actually, that's from the Times. The Metro just calls it ridiculously engaging. So, how far a guy can go just on his wits. But there was a certain obsession there as well. I mean, the fact that as soon as he had a son, he abandoned that son because it meant it took him away from his life, which his life was gambling. There's this towards the end of the book, when a lot of his friends are dying and they're dying broke, and the writer says it makes you question. These guys were walking around with some of the biggest fortunes, and they all died broke. Why was it? Why didn't they put anything away? Why didn't they invest? And he said that's like a wolf saving part of its hunt, saving part of its kill for later. Then it doesn't need to hunt anymore, and they live for the hunt. They live for the sport. I guess that's an interesting perspective, psychological. Oh my God, I've been talking for over 7 minutes, so I don't rate the books lately, do I? 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10, depends if you. Well, I give it 9 out of 10, right? Doesn't matter what other people think, each for their own. Very good book, Titanic, Thompson. It's by Kevin Cook. Thoroughly recommended.